This is my daughter Harriet, and she came to visit me at work. I'm Daniel, a first-year pathology registrar. And so I wanted to talk today about how I've adapted this program, Anki. I'll say Anki because I'm a kind of New Zealander, but I think it's Japanese for memorize normally. But I'll just take a quick poll in the chat about what people's experience level with it is so I can pitch it correctly. So I'll talk today about the principles of why I think using it's a good idea and how I've adapted it to our particular exam needs, but won't go into a technical how-to of how to use it, but something to do later if there was interest. So, some caveats. I haven't done the Part 1 exam yet, but my method seems to be working in terms of practice exams, and I'm also still refining it, so I might yet make changes with the benefit of experience or your ideas too. So what I'm trying to do in my preparation for Part 1 is arrive at the exam with the basic appearance and facts associated with each entity memorized. That would be nice. I'd like to do this while still having time for my family and not to get stressed out. I'd like to have this knowledge past the exam the rest of my life would also be nice. And then I'd like to be artful in how I apply this knowledge, applying it at the right time and expressing it in the right way. So this program, Anki, is my main study tool, but I don't think it is I don't think it's a complete method for preparing for the exams, but I do think it helps me achieve this, but for the other one, probably have to do all of the traditional stuff, looking at slides, double heading, writing answers, all of that good stuff. So a flashcard in its simplest form, something on the front, something on the back, and you test yourself. Then if you are getting more sophisticated with flashcards, you have a system where if you get it right, you move that card into the box for 3 days' time, and then you review it in 3 days' time. If you get it right, you review it after a longer period of time, and then if you get it right, you review it after a longer period of time, and so on and so forth, until the periods of time get really long, like 12 months, 3 years, 6 years. If you get it wrong, you go back to the start. And so that box system is called spaced repetition, and it's based on the idea of the forgetting curve, which on this graph, the y-axis represents your percentage chance of remembering something from 0 to 100, and the x-axis is time. So if you learn something new, as time goes on, you get more likely to forget it. But if you re-review it, that forgetting curve gets flatter. And then if you re-review it, it gets flatter still. And so that's the idea with all of those boxes. And as you get to lengths of time that are 1 year, 2 years, your forgetting curve is still close to 100 at the time when your Part 1 exam is scheduled. So just a quick things about how to make efficient flashcards. The front and back, there is a more efficient form called the close. And take this example. If you wanted to learn the names of these cities, in a close card, instead of putting each one on the front and back of its own card, you just write out the information and then you cover up each bit of information, and each one becomes its individual card. So they would look like this in the Anki program. Australia, Canberra. And New Zealand would have its own one, and Fiji would have its own one. Sorry for the misspelling. And then they would go through your boxes and so on and so forth. Oh yes, so after you show yourself the answer in Anki, it works on an honesty system. So you yourself decide, did I get it right and did I get it wrong? Then you give it feedback on how easy it was for you to remember. You can say easy, like, why did you even show that to me? It's so easy. And all the way down to completely forgot that. and then based on what feedback you give it, the program will decide when to show it to you again. And so as you can imagine, if you are putting cards in all the time, you're going to get a build-up of cards that are due to be remembered. And so when you come in the morning to your computer or phone and open it up, you'll see a number of cards that are due. Some of these may have been made the day before, some of them may have been made 6 months or 5 years before, and they've just come due today. And so they might have come from various ones of these boxes in the past. Another really important way to make efficient cards is to break information up as much as possible into a single word answer that you either get right or you get it wrong. So a bad card would be major cities in New Zealand, Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington. If they were all part of the same card and you do it and you remember 2 out of the 3, you don't really know what score to give yourself, and it gets messy and slow. So with everything, you try and break it up, make it as close as possible to a one-word answer. 3 different cards, that's the way to do it. And you can give yourself prompts and give it some kind of structure in order to facilitate breaking it up into one-word answers. This is called the minimum information principle, and it's the biggest mistake I've seen in the way people use Anki. If you don't use it, you end up with these cumbersome cards that are hard to review, hard to know whether you've remembered it or not, and slow you down. If you use it really strictly, you make these beautiful cards that you can just fly through, answering a card every few seconds, covering huge amounts of information, and not having these road bumps that are created by big clunky ones with too much in the answer. So, I've made a video of myself reviewing my due Anki cards on a particular morning. So in this video, the main thing I wanted to show you was that each card I answer in about 5 or seconds or thereabouts. So they'll probably come and go too fast to be able to read the information on them. But what I want to demonstrate by showing to you this is how it looks and give you a sense of what it's like to use. So I'm thinking about it, seeing the answer, giving myself feedback, thinking about it. So that was about 6 cards, and in a typical morning I would have somewhere between 75 and 150 cards due. So I'll go through them like that, trying to do each one in less than 5 seconds ideally, and I can usually get them all done in half an hour, a very intense half an hour. And so just conceptually how I make them is, if I want to learn about an entity, which is my most common format of card, is I'll read about it, try and understand it in context, and then use expert path and do some snipping of the images to get a really good low power image, a really good high power image, and maybe I try to keep it to 3, an extra image of something that's important in that entity. And then I'll write the information and I'll try and break it up into one word. So even B1 thymoma I feel is 2 pieces of information, and it's better off as 2 separate pieces of information. And give myself these generous prompts so I can just do that final one word of information to test myself on. Each of these I will turn into its own individual card, and then all of those cards will automatically go into the Anki program's review algorithm, and I'll see them the next day and give them feedback and review them as per this schedule. And if I get them right enough times, this interval will extend out to a period of time that covers the Part 1 exam. And if a thymoma comes up, hopefully I have that knowledge memorized. So, this is what the actual cards will look like in the Anki program. So this one's, what's the name of the entity? And then I have a bit of a fancy thing that lets them progressively show me the previous answers, but I won't go into that. But as you can see, it makes these nice little cards to test yourself on. Now I want to show you what an older card, what kind of process it goes through with regard to reviewing. So this one is about the kidney tumor entity, the MCLMP, the multiloculated cystic renal cell neoplasm of low malignant potential. So as you can see, I made the card in, Anki has all these great stats, as you can see. It just keeps these all automatically, and you can get right into them. So I made it in August, and then, sorry, my video is probably in the way, but I was going well, and then I forgot it. And I started again. And I was going well, and the intervals were getting longer, and then I forgot it. And I started again. And now I seem to be, it seems to have stuck, because the last 4 times it's come up, I've remembered it and put in good as my answer, which is what this 3 means, and these intervals are starting to grow. So the review process isn't always smooth, but I think that's actually an advantage, because what it's doing is things that are easy to remember, like oncocytoma, have this super the review interval, the time, will grow really quickly. So you'll do it 1 day, 3 days, 1 week, 6 months, and soon you'll just never see it again, because oncocytoma is not very hard to remember as a name, linked to these, linked to images of an oncocytoma. But this entity is a really difficult one to remember for me, and probably for everyone. And so it actually, the program, by testing me on it, is able to find the things that I'm having trouble remembering, as evidenced by me forgetting. And then because I forgot it, it gives me extra practice to get it right. And so it, you hate the program for it, but it's able, each day you open it, you basically tend to get all the stuff that you always forget, and all of the easy stuff you never see. And so it's painful to do, but it's a really efficient way to review, because you're reviewing all of the hard stuff to remember. And then eventually you remember it, and so that's cool. These boxes again, as you can see, this red ones are going down the red line back to the beginning, and the green ones are getting longer. So I also want to show you how I use Anki to take notes. So from my experience studying, I basically believe now that if I write something down as a note in a notepad, I'm going to forget it. It's better than not writing it down at all, but 3 years' time, I'm not banking on remembering that. I'm not banking on remembering to go back to that notebook at some later point in the future. So I make all of my notes in Anki, which means I don't really make very many. I only write down things that I think are worth the work of reviewing and remembering. And what I want to show you is that the program's so quick that you can do that in real time. So the reason I've got the log open here is I kind of want to show you how I tend to do it when I'm double heading and the consultant tells me a new fact that I want to remember forever. So in this example, it could be that we were looking at an angiokeratoma, and I had some existing notes about it, but then the consultant tells me something new, that that it can you can have multiple angiokeratomas in Fabry disease. And I'd have my laptop there while we're double heading. I'd just be logging cases and things like that. And when that case is done and the consultant's validating or doing something that doesn't need my input, I would create a card. So I've got a little video showing you how I do that. So open Anki, browse, you can see how quick the search is. These were my existing notes on angiokeratoma that I'd written in the past. Just writing in that new piece of information, and then I'll highlight the bit I want to be tested on, and it's done. It's made. And the card would look like this, which is pretty cool. And then so the next day, when I open Anki, there it would be waiting for me. Multiple seen in, and I have to remember it's Fabry disease. So personally, how I incorporate all this into a routine study approach is I try and study for an hour before work and an hour after work. This tends to actually happen about 2 days a week, but it's my goal. And so I do the first half hour reviewing my old cards, like in that first video I showed you, and then I spend the second half hour reading about new material and making new Anki cards of whatever system I'm working through or book, and then go to work or stay at work, and then spend an hour looking at cases without necessarily using Anki. So to go back to those aims I mentioned at the start, I want to arrive at the exam with the basic appearance and facts associated with each entity in my long-term memory, and not like needing hypnosis to retrieve, but like easily retrievable. So I think I've demonstrated how that can be possible. Hopefully I've demonstrated that you can kind of do this. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about the stress-free in the upcoming slides. But with that flat forgetting curve, once these curves are getting, so flat that they're extending for years at a time, it can make that possible. And then this one is why I still do other stuff, like looking at cases. So there's so many benefits. Let me take them one by one. So if you do it this way, then it doesn't matter when the exam is. I did it for BPS, and then just before the BPS, because of COVID, they delayed it by 6 months. And most people were like, I just did all this study and I'm going to have to do all the study again in 6 months' time. And for me, it made no difference at all. Do it now, do it in 6 months' time. And the week before the exam, you can do whatever. Like, there's no need to cram. There's no need to cram at all. You just have this time-independent memory. And then if you take leave, you might have a baby or something and have to take a year out between your first year and the part one. As long as you keep up with the reviews throughout that leave, you'll come back with the same knowledge in your head as when you left. You might have lost some of the, tacit things, but you won't have forgotten all of that book knowledge. It'll still be there, so it gives you this amazing independence. Lets you take advantage of this time, even though it's really far from the exam, without all that advantage being lost by forgetting. It's hard to know what you need to review, so letting a computer decide is a really good idea, I think. And then, as I said, it filters down all of the most difficult stuff, so you spend more time on the things that you're more likely to forget and less time on the things that you're less likely to forget. I'm not really like an experienced note taker, but I don't really get how notes work if you're making them in a book, because I just suspect that a lot of notes get written because it's better than doing nothing, but then there must be these big piles of notebooks that maybe don't get revisited again till right before the exam, or maybe don't get revisited at all. So there's probably ways to make note-taking work with people who are very systematic about it, but I suspect like a lot of notes never get reread, and you can't take your notes into the exam. So if you make all your notes into flashcards, they all go into your brain, which you do take into the exam. So I think it's better. So I also think that retention beyond the exam helps you for future exams. So something that happened recently was that a general pathologist showed me a bone marrow. She gave me a hint. She said it's a lysosomal storage disease. And because in BPS I'd learnt about them, I still have all that in my mind because they're on flat forgetting curves. So I was like, tissue cells. This will be, I call it Gaucher's disease, but it's probably Gaucher or something. And this guy doesn't have glucose cerebrosidase, and he's got a build-up of glucose cerebrosides, and is he Ashkenazi Jew? And it was all still there. And so I found in med school, I did this for the first couple of years. I basically didn't need to do any new study in the second couple of years because all of this content's the same. If you learn it right the first time, You don't have to relearn it for exams later on. And so I wouldn't be surprised if this is really helpful for part 2, because obviously there's different stuff, but I think there would actually be a lot that people would be relearning stuff they'd actually read for their part 1 prep, and that if they were able to remember it, they would be able to use for the part 2. So I think that's a big efficiency benefit. Using those closed type cards lets you link, you see the images the way I make them for everything you ask about it. So it's almost like you map the IHC and the architecture and the name onto that image. So not only do you see the image a lot, but you've got it all sort of linked there mentally. And so consultants often say, this is the image of, oncocytoma. Just imprint this image in your mind, which you want to, but and there's no clear method of how do you imprint an image in your mind apart from I don't know, squinting or something. So this is a systematic way of imprinting the image. More benefits. So as I say, with that time independence, the entity is banked. You study it once and you're done. As long as you study it in the right amount of detail, then there's no need to ever go back and read about that entity. So at the moment I'm working through renal pathology. This is the contents page from Gattuso's differential diagnosis, which somebody told me is a good list of entities to learn for part 1. And so I'm just making a card about each entity, and once I've done it, I've crossed it off. And so my goal is to have these all crossed off by 3rd year, and I won't need to go back and reread anything in the lead up to the exam. I'll just be practicing slides or something like that. It gives you a frame with which to read material. So if you're only taking notes in Anki, you're always looking at it which of this text, which bit of this text is the stuff that I'm going to make a card out of? What is the key word here that I'd want to be able to remember? So that gives you an analytical frame to approach information with, and also a critical one. I'm really not actually, I wouldn't put in the work to memorize this, so I'm not going to read it. And then we've got so many new terms, you've got imperipolesis and these really tricky things to say. And so this gives you practice using those words, and not only knowing them, but sort of a confidence using them. And then we also have innocuous terms that you're liable to forget, I think. So in the breast, say, you've got this thing called a mucocele-like lesion, which looks like a mucocele. So you'd read it, and you'd say, okay, great, I understand that. But 2 years later, when it comes up in the exam, you might not necessarily remember that it's called a mucocele-like lesion. You might not have confidence that that's the exact name. And it's important to give things the exact right terms in our field. So it gives you practice using those deceptively easy ones and getting sure about what things are called. Then if you have a misconception about something, so often, or not often, sometimes get things wrong, and I'm able to easily search what I've learned about the entity and see where the misconception lies. So let's say later with Fabry disease, somebody tells me, well, it's not like they've got multiple versions of your conventional angiokeratoma. They've actually got these sort of lipid deposits in their angiokeratomas. They're a bit different. So I can easily search that card I made and find what it was that I taught myself that was a little bit wrong or with the wrong emphasis, and then just change it. So I think that's really cool. You can, I've shown you the kind of cards I make for entities, but it's infinitely adaptable to learning differentials, classifications, and then if you've got a good mnemonic, sometimes you still need a bit of work to remember the mnemonic, so you can use it to train yourself in using those mnemonics. So I've got an example here. This is both a differential and a mnemonic. It's the SLAM dunk mnemonic, SLAM being the common entities and dunk being the less common ones. So as you can see here, I've tried to use a bit of the minimum information principle and break it into 2 lots to make it less cumbersome. But it helps me learn this differential and be easily be able to bring it to mind when I see an atypical skin spindle cell lesion. And you can use it with anything if you're clever about the way you break it up. Because Anki you can use on your phone, and a card review takes 5 or 10 seconds, you can make your fragments of time really useful. So I found it really good when I was on clinical rotations, which involved lots of waiting around in med school, that I could just do some reviews. If I had 10 spare seconds, I could review 2 cards, and those cards might be changing from reviewing reviewing in 2 weeks to 6 months. So in that 20 seconds, I've changed my memory of something from probably going to forget in a couple of weeks' time to not going to forget for another 6 months. And I think that's pretty cool. And so also, like, if you have a baby or something, you just don't have like proper blocks of time. Your time is just like smashed like a windscreen, and we've got those little bits. So you've just got to keep stopping and starting all the time, and this is actually works like that, although it's much nicer if you can do it in a block of time. So exams are like an active process. So this is in the sense of reading being like a passive activity if you don't put too much thought into it. And most people do a lot of, in the conventional way of studying, I think, do a lot of passive study where they're reading, or it might have a bit of an active component where they're taking some notes. And then before the exam, they do all of their active stuff where they're testing themselves and writing practice answers and stuff. Whereas if you use this, the active part where you're testing yourself on the information is a constant, and you're practicing it all the time, which gives you more practice for the exam, which is ultimately an active process. And so I found that's made exams really easy. I should say I've been doing this since first year of med school and done it in various exams, and all my exams have been easy, stress-free, lovely. I look forward to them. I really feel it gives me like a lot of confidence, and I like seeing the process, bear fruit. So this graph is showing the number of reviews I've done for this deck. So I made this deck of flashcards starting 250 days ago when I became a registrar. And so I've been doing 72 cards on average per day, and that's a total of 18,000 reviews so far. So when I got to BPS, I'd done 30,000 reviews of my cards that I'd made for that, and I'd made about 3,000 cards and reviewed each of them on average 10 times. So it's a really cool feeling going into the exam knowing you've done like 30,000 little practice questions in a way. So some of the drawbacks. So in order for it to work, you've got to do the reviews on a pretty much daily basis, and that's 30 minutes of intense mental work. So that may be 30 minutes of study that you might have otherwise been doing, cases or reading into entities that you'd seen. So that's the biggie. If you fall behind, it builds up. So if you go on holiday for a week, you might spend the better part of a day catching up on all the reviews you missed out on, because there'll be sort of 800 to do from the week you were away or something like that. There's a risk, I think, that you get really used to snap judgments, and that when you encounter something where a snap judgment doesn't help you, you can get a bit distressed. So I try to balance it out with doing stuff where I have to slow down and work on a hard problem. And then it makes you read more narrowly. Basically, you just end up looking for a good summary. You understand it in context, so you read a bit to get the context, but you're pretty much getting summaries and just memorizing those summaries. So you read kind of narrowly and remember everything, as opposed to people who read widely and remember like bits of things. So over the years I've showed it to people, and some people have picked up the ball and run with it, and this is how they study now, and then some people haven't. So I think it interacts with your personality, and obviously lots of people are successful without this. So it's by no means the only study method, but I think it suits a certain personality. Myself, I have a low tolerance of ambiguity in general, so if I forget something, I'm quite distressed by that, and the opportunity to control what I know and have that security that I know it is I would work for that. I'd never been a crammer. I'd rather spread out my study, not like have any bad sleep or anything before the exam, and then not have any worries about this whole cram period coming up and all of that. And then I really like playing musical scales and playing sports and going to the gym and stuff. So having this like review time turns study into a bit of a sport for me. I come in and I try to do this like really intense focus and try and work on my card times and see if I can get them down and stuff like that. And that suits me because I'm into that kind of thing. But most people don't do this and they're fine. Another way to think of it, I think it's on a given day, studying like this only has a tiny advantage compared to somebody who's doing cases and reading, or may even be like not as good when you look at it in the time of just a one-day space. But from my experience, so I've been doing it for like 6 or 7 years now, is that if I do it consistently over a long period of time, that small benefit of using this method builds up until I'm able to leverage it to have these huge amounts of information in my head and just be able to be like bam, bam, bam when I see entities. And so if Archimedes had Anki, he might have said something like that. So let's have a wee drink. If you're going to try it, here are some tips. Use those close type cards where you're blanking stuff out rather than the front and back. Just start with the close basic setting before going too far down the rabbit hole of all the other card types. It's an open source software. It's free, I should mention, except for the iPhone app, but on the computer and Android it's free. So all of these Anki users make their own programs that you can personalize Anki. So one of them is called Close Overlapper, which once you're getting into using it heavily, I think adds efficiency. But I wouldn't do that at the start because it's full of bugs and it would probably be too much to learn how to use at the start. The minimum information principle is probably the number one thing. Answers should be one word. Is really important. If there are lots of words, it's hard to know if you got it right or wrong. It takes too long to review your cards, and it gets really cumbersome. Just see if you can break things up into one word, and it makes it so you can just fly through your reviews, and it makes it really nice. At first I thought the questions had to be quite hard, or otherwise I wouldn't remember them when push came to shove in real life. But it turns out not to be the case. You can actually make them much easier than you think you need to, and you'll still be able to remember them when it comes to an exam and stuff. Start slow. So one person I showed it to a couple of weeks later, she was saying, I've got like 400 cards to review every day, and I'm spending like 2.5 hours reviewing, which can be good, but at the beginning probably is indicative of biting off more than you can chew. So just, if you're going to do it as something new, I'd incorporate it slowly alongside however you study at the moment. There's obviously the option of making your own cards versus downloading decks of other people's cards. I'm happy to give out my cards, but ultimately I think you need to know the context that card was written in, and it's going to take a long time to figure out the context that somebody else wrote their card in, and it's actually faster just to read the context yourself and make your own cards. I'm a fan of putting every subject area in one deck. So you would have seen in that video, there was lots of thymoma cards because I'd made them the day before, and it might have looked like this was a mediastinum deck. But then hopefully you saw that there was some placenta and there was some like a myofibroma, which is like soft tissue, and then there was something else. So I think if you put them all in one deck, you're fresh on any subject, and whatever subject comes your way, you'll be ready. If you make them different decks will get neglected, and you basically end up in the same problem as people who make notes and don't have time to go back and read them. I like to have some kind of context before I choose what things to remember. So differential diagnosis is a good good framework for me. So an example would be a B1 thymoma. You could learn that it occurs in older adults. But I think it's better to read the differential and see where that's important. So one area where it's important is that it can be a differential against a lymphoblastic lymphoma. They look the same at low power. But one of the really important ways you differentiate them is the age of the patient. The lymphoma is a disease of children. Thymoma is a disease of adults. And so I would tend to write that information. Perhaps I'll just make the two cards at the same time, so I've got that connection in my head. Or I might, instead of just saying thymoma age question mark, I might say thymoma age versus lymphoblastic lymphoma. And then it prompts me to remember that that's why the age is important. And the answer would just be something like adults. Or maybe older adults, above 50 or something. For it to work, you can't just make cards and do them sometimes. You really have to do it regularly so that your the forgetting curve isn't dropping to 0 before you review them, because you want to kind of hit the review before the review curve's sunk too far. So you got to do it every day. But I've done it as little as 2 or 3 times a week, and it still works, but your efficiency drops. You have to start lots of cards again. It's a bit painful. Anki is shortcut keys. You shouldn't need the mouse at all, and the mouse will slow you down. And then learn the snipping shortcuts on your computer for getting pictures into your Anki cards really quickly. Excuse me. Oof. So I'd be really interested to know how that might impact your study. I think obviously people have really successful study methods to have made it this far, and have refined and built their study methods over time. So I would actually be surprised if this changes many people's study techniques. I know it would be pretty hard for someone to sell me a different study technique than what I use, but I think there are definitely people who I've told this to who wish they'd heard about it sooner and stuff like that. So I'd be interested to know if there's anybody here who has kind of heard this and thinks they might experiment with it. So in the chat, if you could write 1, 2, or 3, and any questions or comments, I'd love to see that and discuss anything.